With enormous influence from the biotech and the agribusiness companies, the administration at that time approved GMOs, even though they had very little evidence to determine whether they were safe or unsafe. And now there is accumulating evidence about possible health impacts of GMOs.
Watch on to find out more. As a pioneer in permaculture, Mr. Minh Quang will be our host today. He is a kind and considerate farmer from Ao Lac, also known as Vietnam. He owns a large plantation on which he grows a wide variety of fruits and vegetables, including watermelon, cucumbers, tomatoes, potatoes, carrots, lettuce, and herbs. His motto is "My customer's health is my top priority." Mr. Minh Quang learned to cultivate since his childhood from his parents, and he is continuously researching, learning, and applying new techniques to grow clean, fresh, delicious, and healthy fruits and vegetables for his valued customers.
Chào mừng quý khán giả biết nhìn xa trông rộng. Tôi là Minh Quang từ Âu Lạc xinh đẹp, còn được biết là Việt Nam. Chào mừng đến với chương trình Địa cầu, ngôi nhà thân ái, sinh vật biến đổi gen, mối nguy hại cho sức khỏe và môi trường. Phần 1 trong 2 phần. Phỏng vấn ký giả môi trường kiêm giảng viên Mark Shapiro. Ông sẽ chia sẻ những hiểu biết của mình về tác động tới sức khỏe và môi trường của sinh vật biến đổi gen, còn được gọi là GMO. Bây giờ chúng ta hãy gặp ông Shapiro.
I'm Mark Shapiro. I'm a journalist. Been doing environmental journalism for some decades, and I also teach at the UC Berkeley Graduate School of Journalism.
Bây giờ, ông Shapiro sẽ thảo luận về những lý do chính mà GMO được tạo ra.
GMOs were created to control specific traits within a plant. A plant is a living organism that can evolve and adapt to circumstances. And so on the one hand was the desire to create a highly specific trait. And that trait in its earliest days was designed to act in two ways. One was to create internal resistance to corn pests, called the Bt corn. And the other was to create a seed that would give birth to a plant that was actually immune to the effects of a deadly herbicide. So Monsanto was one of the earliest companies to develop genetically engineered crops, and Monsanto is also a chemical company. So you had a chemical company that manufactured a chemical called Roundup, which was a very limited application way back in the 70s and 80s. It was mostly for gardeners who wanted to use it to control weeds. And Monsanto had the insight that if you could manipulate genetically a seed to exhibit resistance to its own chemical, then you could apply the chemical on all these fields and its seed would survive and actually deliver, in this case, soybeans. So the motive from the very earliest stages was primarily to coordinate the seed with the chemical. There were other reasons which I think had to do with the desire to short-circuit the breeding process and insert genes that would create specified traits which could be used by farmers. In the realm of human health, the data is not exactly clear. GMOs were approved for introduction into the food system at a time when there was very little scientific studies that existed on the use of GMOs. So we're talking back in 1992 when GMOs were officially approved in the United States. With enormous influence from the biotech and the agribusiness companies, the administration at that time approved GMOs, even though they had very little evidence to determine whether they were safe or unsafe. And now there is accumulating evidence about possible health impacts of GMOs. I think some of the concerns that are being raised are essentially the way that the microbiota in the gut interact with genetically engineered foods, and the possible allergic reactions of people who might be allergic to the thing, which is the gene that's introduced from one organism into another. And if you're allergic to the first organism, you may actually end up being allergic to the food that it's introduced into. On the question of the impact of genetically engineered crops on our agricultural system and on the farm ecosystem, that is actually coming to be very clear. I think that the genetic engineering of crops is leading to large disruptions in our farm growing lands. There have been hundreds and hundreds of seed varieties have been replaced by genetically engineered seeds, and the pests, insects that they are supposed to resist are developing resistance to the genetically engineered seeds. The second thing is their impact on human health, their potential contribution to cancers, carcinogenic potential, particularly when it comes to Roundup, glyphosate, a lot of issues surrounding the potential dangers. Most of the major producers of genetically engineered seeds are also chemical companies. So they breed seeds not to be resistant to chemicals on their own, but to be born addicted to chemicals. Genetically engineered seeds are very tightly bred to actually survive in one particular set of environmental conditions. And so you have genetically engineered seeds that are really not able to adapt to the volatile situation that we are in.
Bây giờ chúng tôi xin phép thưởng thức một số món ăn thuần chay hữu cơ ngon lành để tăng cường sức sống. Chúng tôi sẽ quay lại ngay. Xin vui lòng giữ làn sóng truyền hình vô thượng sư. Chào mừng trở lại chương trình phỏng vấn ký giả môi trường kiêm giảng viên Mark Shapiro. Chúng ta sẽ tiếp tục khám phá tác động hủy hoại sức khỏe và môi trường của các sinh vật biến đổi gen hay còn gọi là GMO. Ông Shapiro thừa nhận mọi người trên khắp thế giới đang yêu cầu chấm dứt việc sử dụng GMO do nhiều hậu quả tiêu cực của phương pháp sản xuất thực phẩm dựa trên hóa chất nhân tạo này.
I think that there is a truly global effort to resist the spread of GMOs around the world. I've talked to a lot of farmers, a lot of scientists, a lot of citizens, engaged people, and I think there's enormous resistance to having a seed that's bred in a laboratory in a combination that would never occur in nature to be used on such a widespread level for our food. And I think that is becoming a serious concern all over the United States, all over the world. In the U.S., we've seen huge surge of interest among citizens who are demanding food that does not contain genetic engineering ingredients. And so now you have major food companies even saying non-GMO, and it shows you how sensitive an issue this is, because the industry knows that if people know that there are GMOs in their food, they probably won't buy it. And for that reason, the GMO industries, the biotech companies, the agrochemical companies that are linked to those companies have poured millions of dollars into defeating efforts on a statewide level to compel a labeling of food that contains genetically engineering ingredients.
Ông Shapiro tin rằng canh tác hữu cơ nên được ưu tiên cùng với lối ăn thuần chay và nông dân nên được trợ cấp để theo phương thức canh tác tự nhiên bền vững.
People are becoming aware that the food we eat directly contributes to the state of our health. But I think the important thing is that people understand the impacts of toxic chemicals that are applied to conventionally grown crops, which have an array of damaging impacts both on human health but also on the ecological health of farm systems. Chemicals now that kill the bees that are necessary to pollinate crops from one to another, that kill beneficial plants other than the crop, which are actually habitat to things like butterflies, another very important part of our ecosystems. So the more people understand the destructive collateral impacts of consuming the chemicals that are put on their food, the impact it has on their own health, their children's health, and the health of other organisms, I think people will gravitate increasingly towards organic food. And when you think about the industrial agriculture model now, it's all about taking all those nutrients that have been depleted from the soil by the chemical-saturated crops, because they've so depleted the existing nitrogen levels in the soil. They need synthetic fertilizers and synthetic substances to protect them, because they no longer have the innate capacity to protect themselves. And so we're actually breeding weaker and weaker and weaker crops that are more and more dependent on chemicals to defend themselves. They also come in the form of crop insurance in terms of the types of crops that are insured and are not insured, favor over and over again the kind of industrial type agriculture. And so when we talk about assisting organic farmers, we're talking about shifting the subsidy system that already exists from one form of exploitative and depleting agriculture towards one that is more regenerative, like the organic agriculture. To encourage vegetarianism, of course, I think if people ate more vegetables and fruits and less animal products, the impact could be profound in terms of the amount of land that is devoted to meat, to cattle, and the resources that consumes, and the contribution of all those animals to methane production. It comes out of the waste of animals, of course, and methane is a very potent greenhouse gas. So you're actually creating a healthy diet, and you're reducing the contribution to climate change. We have reached a point at which the impacts of climate change are already being felt. So the Earth is already undergoing what amounts to essentially environmental trauma. And that trauma is to the systems that this great, fantastic organism we have the good fortune to live on here on Earth has sustained itself and created the conditions within which we've been able to thrive. Now, this fantastic combination of gases and balancing of nutrients in the earth, in the water, gases in the atmosphere have created a unique combination of conditions to enable humans to thrive. We are now in the middle of disrupting that incredible balancing act of the earth, so we can already see the impacts of climate change all across the world in terms of the disruptive and highly volatile weather systems. And the issue now is, can we slow down the process that's already underway so that we prevent the truly catastrophic shifts that are coming our way if we keep going in the same path? Well, we already see my latest book, Seeds of Resistance, talks about the profound disturbances underway in the food-growing regions of the earth. And those disturbances include the steadily rising temperatures, the diminishment of water supplies, the accelerating pace of extreme events that is being very disruptive to the current food system. We see it in declining yields in some of the biggest food-growing areas of the United States, for example, in the Central Valley of California. We see it in the Midwest. We see it in the Southwest. So now the question is, how do we develop a different kind of food system that is much more able to adapt to these kind of extremes? And that's what we face right now. And I do believe we can develop that. My book, Seeds of Resistance, is all about, is how to develop seeds that are capable of responding to these conditions, adapting to them, and being far more resilient to the changes that we're going through and are going to accelerate.
Chúng tôi xin phép ra ngoài để thu hoạch một số rau củ hữu cơ ở sau vườn. Chúng tôi sẽ quay trở lại ngay. Xin vui lòng giữ làn sóng truyền hình Vô Thượng Sư. Chào mừng trở lại với chương trình Địa cầu, ngôi nhà thân ái, sinh vật biến đổi gen, mối nguy hại cho sức khỏe và môi trường. Phần 2 trong 2 phần. Giới thiệu khí giả môi trường kiêm giảng viên Mark Shapiro ông đang thảo luận về các hậu quả tiêu cực lên sức khỏe và môi trường do sinh vật biến đổi gen hoặc GMO gây ra. Mối liên hệ giữa biến đổi khí hậu và nền kinh tế ngày càng trở nên rõ ràng hơn, như ông Shapiro giải thích sau đây.
I think there's a false dichotomy between addressing the questions around climate change and the questions around economic growth in the global economy. And the dichotomy is based on this fundamental illusion, based on this idea that here, on the one hand, we have the status quo, which is, let's say, where we are right now. And if we, as a society, begin to recognize and respond to climate change and do the kind of changes in our energy grid and our technologies and our lifestyles that are necessary, it's going to cost this much. So are we, as an economic entity, willing to spend this amount of extra money to respond to this situation? Complete illusion. Because over here, we are actually spending massive amounts of money already on the climatic disruptions that are occurring. Billions of dollars spent to deal with the kind of disasters that come through climate change, the hurricanes in this country and around the world that cost billions of dollars to recover from. In this country, in the United States anyway, of insurance payouts to farmers whose crops fail in the face of huge crop losses due to climatic disruptions, the emergence of new diseases and illnesses that in humans and in livestock and in plants, whole new varieties of diseases and pests that are costing billions of dollars to contend with, to deal with the consequence of climate change. It's just not called climate money. It's called health money over here, or it's called insurance money over there, or it's called rebuilding after a hurricane over here. All those should be called climate expenses. And once we start actually doing that, we'll see that actually investing in renewable energy and different less greenhouse gas intensive industries is not nearly as expensive as we think, and very importantly, generates huge amounts of income activity within an economy because it creates tens of thousands of new jobs, new investment opportunities. And I think you see that now in the global business sector, the major insurance companies starting to pull out of their fossil fuel investments, major financial firms starting to retreat from their investments, big companies being compelled by financial authorities in the United Kingdom, France, in Germany, elsewhere, other than the United States, of course, has retreated from this idea. But in the other major economies of the world, in Japan, companies must report to investors the threat presented by climate change to their bottom line. So in many ways, global business is even far more ahead of the political leadership. They also see enormous business opportunity in the changes ahead, the renewable energy opportunities, the numerous, vast shifting of resources from fossil fuel intensive to more renewable forms of energy. What does renewable mean? On the one hand, non-renewable energy means the oil comes out of the ground and it's never coming back. We have to actually deal with this change at some point. And the longer we wait to do that change, the worse it's going to get.
Ông Mark Shapiro nhấn mạnh nhu cầu cấp bách cần hành động của nhân loại để giảm thiểu biến đổi khí hậu.
It is completely within humans' capacity to mitigate the effects of climate change. Mitigation is twofold. One is we have the capacity to reduce our contribution to climate change, and our contribution comes from the emission of greenhouse gases, which comes from the use of non-renewable fossil fuel energy sources. And we've shown over and over and over again that we completely have the capacity to do that. I live in the state of California, the biggest state in the country, arguably one of the more complex economies among all states in the United States. California has seen a steady drop in the greenhouse gas emissions over the past 5 or 6 years since there's imposed a price for carbon within the state of California through market mechanisms. So we have every capacity to both reduce our greenhouse gas emissions and we can mitigate the impact. We need to start building soft barriers along coastlines to, protect people from the rising sea. I mean, we need to actually start thinking ahead about how we're going to deal with this kind of climate-stressed environment. Well, I think the decisions that you make, the actions you take, can actually very much have an effect on how we move forward. The decisions you make about the food you eat goes down to the seeds that are planted, which is what I describe in my book, Seeds of Resistance. And the same thing applies to the kind of energy sources that we use. You can decide to either utilize renewable energy or pressure your government to actually encourage that shift in energy sources. So this is very much within the power of humans to influence. And now is the time to be doing it.
Thưa quý khán giả thông thái, thật hân hạnh được đồng hành cùng quý vị trong chương trình Địa cầu ngôi nhà thân ái, sinh vật biến đổi gen, mối nguy hại cho sức khỏe và môi trường, phần 2 trong 2 phần. Xin vui lòng giữ làn sóng để theo dõi thêm nhiều chương trình khai trí trên truyền hình Vô Thượng Sư. Tiếp theo là kẻ hủy hoại sức khỏe, thuốc lá điện tử, ngay sau tin đáng chú ý. Cầu mong tháng ngày của quý vị được gia ân trong ánh sáng và hòa bình.
Insightful viewers, it was a pleasure to be with you for today's program, Genetically Modified Organisms, Health and Environmental Hazards, Part 2 of 2. Please stay tuned for more edifying programs here on Supreme Master Television. Coming up next is Health Destroyer, E-cigarettes and vaping, right after noteworthy news. May your days be graced with light and peace. For more details, please visit suprememastertv.com/PE.